In a quiet part of the animal shelter, Charlie the cat was crying because he missed his owner. His family had left him there and didn't know how sad he was at night. One day, Dr. White was checking on Charlie and noticed something odd on his collar. Looking closer at the tag, his eyes grew wide. "Oh my God," he whispered, quickly calling for his assistant. Emma hurried in. "What's wrong, Dr. White?" she asked, looking between him and Charlie, who was still curled up in the corner. "Are you sure the woman who brought him in said her last name was Carter?" Scott asked. Emma looked confused. "Yes, she said her name was Grace, and his was Francis." "Why?" Scott paused. "Because that's not what the tag says." Charlie had been very sad since arriving at the shelter. Grace Carter, whose husband had died, brought him in, saying he only ever listened to Francis. The family couldn't care for him anymore and had to leave him. "If possible, we'll come back for him," Grace had said, wiping away tears. Scott put Charlie in a cage, watching as the cat curled against the wall, still softly crying. Though animals often feel grief, Charlie's sadness was deeper than anything Scott had seen before. "I'm going to check on Charlie," Scott told Emma later, still thinking about his strange feeling. He found Charlie covering his face with his paws. As Scott knelt down, he saw the collar still around Charlie's neck. "Let's take that off," he said gently, reaching out. But Charlie suddenly screeched, jumping back and hissing. Scott froze with his hands up, surprised by this reaction. "Why won't you let me take your collar off?" he wondered out loud. He had glimpsed the tag and felt confused. "I must have seen wrong," he told himself. But something felt strange. Scott moved closer, speaking softly. "Hey, Charlie, it's okay," he whispered, carefully extending his hand. Charlie's eyes narrowed, and with a quick hiss, he swiped at Scott, nearly scratching him. Realizing force wouldn't work, Scott backed away. Frustrated but determined, Scott left the cage to think of a new plan. Charlie wasn't just sad, he was protecting something. A few minutes later, Scott returned with a treat and toy. "Let's try again, buddy," he said gently, placing the treat near the door before stepping back. Charlie hesitated, watching Scott, but eventually moved forward, sniffing, then taking the treat. Scott stayed still, with a small smile. This was progress. As Charlie ate, Scott talked softly, sharing stories about his own pets. Slowly, Charlie began to relax, his body less tense. Scott tried again, more determined this time. Charlie was still careful, but their bond was growing stronger. Using another treat, Scott got Charlie to lift his head just enough to see the tag. His heart skipped a beat. "Oh my God," he whispered. The name on the metal wasn't what he expected. It was a discovery that changed everything. "Emma, could you come here, please?" he called urgently. She rushed in, feeling the tension. "What's wrong?" she asked, looking between Scott and Charlie. Scott pointed at the collar. Whatever was written there was about to turn everything upside down. Scott was trying to solve a mystery that only seemed to get more complicated. Each new clue raised more questions. "Emma, do you know Grace's full name? Are we sure their last name was Carter?" he asked quickly, his mind racing. Emma looked surprised and confused. "I'll check the papers. Why? What's wrong?" she asked, sensing his urgency. "That name isn't on the tag," Scott replied, sounding worried and doubtful. Emma's eyebrows rose. "Not on the tag? Then who?" She stopped, suddenly understanding what this might mean. "I'll check right now," she said, quickly leaving. Scott looked again at the tag, trying to read the faint name scratched into the worn metal. It was like trying to read something carved into an old desk, faded and hard to see. Charlie's moving around for treats made it even harder to get a clear look. Scott felt frustrated. The collar seemed to hold the answer to everything, yet he couldn't read its secret. Emma returned with a folder. Yes, they're definitely Carters. Grace Elizabeth Carter Mason and Francis Antonius Carter, she confirmed. Scott was confused. If that was true, why didn't the name on the tag match? Nothing made sense. He looked at Charlie, who was curled around his collar like it was precious. Taking it would only upset him more. Scott sighed and decided to leave it, carefully closing Charlie's cage. But he couldn't stop thinking about it. He needed answers. Back at his desk, he looked through Charlie's records. Every clinic visit, every note. Each detail was a clue leading to the truth. One thing stood out. Charlie had been a patient for 6 years, but he was clearly older, at least 10. Where was he before? Who took care of him? And why was his name scratched out on the tag? The next step was to visit the Carters' home. Maybe they had the missing piece to this puzzle. Before leaving, Scott told Emma and Yara, "I'm going out for a bit," he said. "Call me if anything happens." They nodded, used to his sudden investigations. Sitting in his car, he entered Grace's address in the GPS. The mystery of the caller wouldn't leave his mind. As the car started, his head filled with theories. What if Charlie was part of something bigger? What if the name on the collar was erased for a reason? Sorry for the interruption. Before we continue with the story, I kindly ask you to like the video and subscribe to this channel. It is very important for us. Thank you very much. He pushed the gas pedal, driven by wonder. When he finally got to the Carter house, the huge building stood before him, its quietness almost strange. Scott stopped the car and stepped out, his heart beating faster as he walked to the big front door. He knocked hard and waited. Soon, the door opened with a creak, showing a woman, definitely not Grace. "Hi, I'm here about Charlie, Grace's cat. I really need to talk to her," Scott said, hoping she wouldn't think his request was weird. The woman looked at him with interest before answering. "Oh, Mom's not home right now," she said, then added, "but maybe I can help." Scott paused briefly. He hadn't planned for this, but decided to try anyway. "Would you mind if I looked at some old family pictures? Maybe from about 6 years ago? I'm looking for something about Charlie." Jane seemed surprised at the request, but wasn't too bothered. "Sure, that's a bit strange, but let's see what we can find," she said, moving aside to let him in. As Jane went upstairs to get the albums, Scott stood in the grand entrance, taking in the house's fancy details. Everything here showed history and wealth, but to Scott it also seemed to hold secrets. His gaze moved to an oil painting on the wall, a formal picture of Francis Carter. There was something about how he was painted, almost like his eyes were following him. Then another photo caught Scott's attention. It was Grace and Francis, smiling warmly, with Charlie sitting between them. The cat looked completely happy in their arms, and there, around his neck, was the exact same collar. Scott leaned closer, squinting. The letters on the tag were clearer in the photo than they had been in real life. He tried to read them. His heart beat faster. The letters didn't match Grace or Francis. This realization confused him even more. Who had Charlie really belonged to? Before he could think about it more, Jane's footsteps sounded down the stairs, breaking the quiet. Jane held a book tightly, turning to Scott with a mix of wonder and eagerness. "Why are you so interested in that picture?" she asked. Scott hesitated, thinking about how much to tell. He thought about making something up, but chose to be honest instead. "I'm really caught up in Charlie's story. especially after Frances died, he admitted. Jane's face softened, with a hint of sadness crossing it. My dad found Charlie after he was hit by a car. He was so afraid. It took a long time to calm him down, she said, her voice full of fond memories. Scott listened carefully. Why didn't Frances take him to a vet? Oh, he tried, but Charlie panicked every time he got near a car. He'd just run away and hide. It was easier to take care of him at home. Jane then said, He's been with us for 6 years now. Scott froze. 6 years? That didn't match what he had thought about Charlie's past. As they looked through the album, he noticed Charlie's collar in one of the older photos. Something about it caught his eye. Has he always had this collar? Scott asked. Jane frowned slightly, thinking back. Yeah, he has. Scott's wonder grew. Do you remember anyone who might have owned him before? Jane shook her head. No, we never knew where he came from before my dad found him. They kept turning pages until one specific photo caught Scott's attention. It was older, and unlike Charlie's current tag, which was now scratched and worn, the name on this one was still easy to read. Scott's heart raced. This was a clue. Can I borrow this? It might help me figure something out, he asked. Jane paused for a moment, then nodded, trusting Scott with the photo. Back at the clinic, Scott laid the picture on the counter in front of Emma and Yara. Look at this. Emily Harrington, he pointed out. A quick internet search showed a woman by that name living in a nearby town. The timing fit perfectly. Scott's heart beat faster as he dialed her number. I might have found your lost cat, he explained carefully, his voice steady but unsure, as if he wasn't completely certain how she would react. Emily blinked, her mind trying to understand the words. Her heart pounded, and for a long moment she just stared at Scott, looking for any sign that this was a mistake or some kind of mean joke. But his face remained honest. You think you found Charlie? She finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Scott nodded. I believe so. Would you be willing to come to the clinic and see for yourself? Still stunned, Emily managed a small nod. She couldn't find the right words, but she knew there was only one answer. Yes, of course. The drive to the clinic felt unreal. Her mind flashed back to the day she had lost him, the many flyers she had put up, and the pain that had never really gone away. She had tried to move on, tried to accept that he was gone, but now there was hope. When she arrived, Scott led her down the quiet hallway toward the cages, his steps measured and careful. The smell of cleaning products and faint traces of animal fur filled the air, bringing her to the present. Her pulse quickened as they stopped in front of a small cage. Scott gestured gently. He's in there. Inside the cage, a gray tabby sat curled in a tight ball, his green eyes wary and untrusting. At first, Charlie yowled, a sharp, defensive cry, the kind she had heard so many times before when he felt trapped or unsure. Emily's breath caught in her throat, that sound. It was so familiar. Scott stepped aside, letting her move closer. Charlie stopped mid-yowl. His ears moved forward, his pupils widening as he saw her face. Emily hesitated. She felt a lump forming in her throat, a mix of hope and fear. What if he didn't know her? What if too much time had passed? Slowly, carefully, she held out her hand, palm open, giving him the chance to come to her on his own terms. Charlie sniffed, his whiskers twitching. A long, quiet moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken feeling. Then, suddenly, something changed. His tail flicked, his posture shifted, and a deep purr rumbled from his chest. Emily barely had a moment to react before Charlie leaned in, pressing his forehead against her palm and rubbing against her with clear affection. A sharp gasp escaped her as tears filled her eyes. "I lost him 6 years ago during a move," she choked out. "I searched everywhere, but he was just gone." Scott watched quietly as she ran her fingers through Charlie's fur, her touch light but loving, as though she were afraid this moment might disappear like a dream. Their bond was undeniable. But just as the room settled into the warmth of reunion, the sound of footsteps broke the moment. Yara, the clinic's helper, appeared in the doorway, her face tense. "Scott," she said hesitantly, "Grace Carter is here." Scott turned to face her. "Grace?" His eyebrows furrowed. Yara nodded, glancing between him and Emily. "She looks upset." Scott exhaled sharply and exchanged a look with Emily before giving her a reassuring nod. "I'll be right back." He stepped into the lobby, where Grace Carter stood near the front desk, her hands clasped tightly. Her face, lined with age, showed grief and uncertainty. For a moment, there was quiet. "I heard you found a cat," Grace finally said, her voice steady but fragile. Scott nodded. "Yes, we did." Grace swallowed hard. Is it Charlie?" Emily had followed quietly, standing just behind Scott. As she stepped forward, her eyes met Grace's, and something unspoken passed between them. The talk that followed was hard at first, both women holding on to their own pain, their own truths. Emily spoke of the heartbreak of losing Charlie, of the months and years spent searching for him, never fully able to accept that he was gone. Grace listened, her fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. Then, in a quiet voice, she shared her side of the story, how she and her late husband had found Charlie wandering, how they had nursed him back to health, and how over time he had become part of their family. As they talked, the tension between them slowly eased. There was no blame, no anger, only love for the same cat. Their stories wove together in a way neither had expected, forming a bridge of understanding. After a long pause, Grace exhaled softly. "I suppose he's always had 2 families, hasn't he?" Emily blinked at her, then slowly she nodded. "Yes, I think he has." And so, after much thought, they came to a decision, one that neither had expected but both felt was right. Charlie would have 2 homes, 2 families, and all the love he had ever known. Scott watched as they reached their agreement, a deep feeling of fulfillment washing over him. Charlie's journey had come full circle. Sometimes love wasn't about choosing. Sometimes it was about sharing. Did you like this story? Do you also support the final choice to share custody of Charlie? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the story, hit the subscribe button and give it a thumbs up. Sharing the love for a pet is something beautiful. What's your opinion? Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you in our next video. Enjoy your day.